What is going on, Headliner Nation? Hopefully everyone is doing well out there. Welcome to the Week 6 Waiver Wire Show, where today we are going to be covering everything that you may need to know to start off Week 6 of fantasy football. We'll be going through some of the top injuries we saw in Week 5, the upcoming bye weeks, some studs who sucked last week as well, plus the best available players out there on the waiver wire. We'll then put them into some power rankings for you. We'll go through start or stash with these guys, some FAAB budget recommendations, Streamin Ds, and we'll even cover a few players that you can consider dropping at this point. Now, there are timestamps to all of these different sections down below in the description, and if you like that, do me a favor and hit the like button. But okay, it's Monday, and I am pumped because once again, I hit my creator pack inside of Underdog Fantasy last week. There were thousands of people that ended up following that, and if they did, they more than doubled their money, and I love to see that. Now, we're going to be doing it again this week on Friday as well, where I'll post a video with my picks of the week. So be sure to be all signed up on Underdog so you can come along and play with us. Just head over to Underdog Fantasy or download the app. Create a new account using the referral code Headliners when you do so. Then all you gotta do is make your minimum $10 deposit and you'll get all the promos that they're gonna be offering in Week 6. Plus, when you play $5, they're giving you $100 in bonus funds. Play 5, get 100. It's an absolute no-brainer and we have a ton of fun doing it. Now there's links down below in the description. Be sure to check that out as soon as the video is over. But okay, let's go ahead and dive into Week 6, and let's first start by talking about a few of the major injuries we saw in Week 5. Now, as we pull up the injuries, the first thing you're gonna notice is there's not as many. However, there is one name that absolutely sucks that it appears on this list, and it's running back Omarion Hampton of the Los Angeles Chargers. He suffered an ankle injury. He was seen in a walking boot after the game. There is a high likelihood that he could miss Week 6, and that absolutely blows for fantasy owners. We also have Darius Slayton. Not a huge name, but definitely a name that people were talking about here with Malik Neighbors' injury in New York, but he suffered a hamstring injury. More than likely, he misses Week 6 as well. But I'm used to this being like a laundry list full of names, so the fact that we only have 2 guys that we're talking about that really got injured in Week 5, that is an absolute positive right now. Now, that does not mean we're out of the woods, though. There are always a few players that pop up on the injury report as the week goes on, so be sure to tune into the start and sit videos and the rankings videos so we can give constant updates on those players. But for now, let's move in to some players who absolutely sucked this past week. We'll talk about guys like Quentin Johnston. 4.9 fantasy points last week is not ideal, but he can't have a big game every single week. Losing a fumble did hurt as well. My level of panic here is still pretty low when it comes to Quentin Johnston. How about Woody Marks in Houston? There was so much hype surrounding Woody Marks last week. Came out 2.4 fantasy points, and the usage just was not expected. I'm pretty sure at this point that head coach DeMeco Ryans was probably playing against him in fantasy football. Woody Marks had played at least minimum 48% of the snaps in back-to-back weeks, and he absolutely exploded in Week 4. Then he comes out in Week 5, gets 39% of the snaps and only 7 touches in a blowout game against Baltimore. Now, I'm not going to overly panic yet, but if his snaps continue to decrease, this panic will rise quickly. How about Trey McBride, the tight end in Arizona? Only 6.6 fantasy points last week. He still had 7 targets, but just did not see anything deeper down the field. Those deeper targets were going the way of Marvin Harrison Jr. last week. So really, between that and the running backs soaking up a lot of the rushing touchdowns, Trey McBride had a down week. How about Kenneth Walker? 9.1 fantasy points. He's the current RB 17 overall on the season. And yes, it absolutely sucks that Zach Charbonnet is so involved in this offense, but this is why we stressed grabbing both of these guys this offseason. Because as of right now, when they're both healthy, they're both startable. And if one of them were to go down, you have a top 12 locked in running back. So I get it. It does suck that Kenneth Walker is splitting touches, but remember, where he was drafted, he is currently returning draft value. So don't let the greed of your RB3 possibly not being a top 5 guy really get to you in fantasy football. Like I said, returning draft value through 5 weeks is still a good sign. How about Keenan Allen? He had 8.3 fantasy points last week. He still led the team in targets with 9. The Washington defense just played pretty well, and you could really tell that last week the Chargers made a constant effort in trying to include Ladd McConkey for the first time in forever. Being that Keenan Allen still had verge 10 targets though, I'm not worried. How about Jamison Williams? Only 1.5 fantasy points. And typically, I would probably be a little bit worried, but this is what Jamison Williams is. He is a boom or bust type player. Every time you throw him in your lineup, you know you're either about to get like sub 5 points or 20 points, and really not a whole lot in between. Then we got Hunter Henry in New England, 5.6 fantasy points, and it really didn't matter if he was open all game or not last week. They were going to find a way to get Stephon Diggs the football as much as humanly possible against the Buffalo Bills. I'm not overly worried about Hunter Henry. James Cook, 4.9 fantasy points. And why they refuse to use him more in the passing game is just odd to me, but he is still dominating touches on the ground. He is one of the best running backs in fantasy football. We're not panicking after one bad game. Then we get down to Derrick Henry. 9.3 fantasy points, but he was saved by a touchdown. The problem that I'm starting to see here is that opposing defenses do not care about Cooper Rush. He does not strike any fear into those defenses. Now, because of that, opposing defenses are just going to sell out on the run and force Cooper Rush to try to beat them down the field, but spoiler alert, he can't beat them down the field. Between that and the Baltimore defense just being decimated with injuries, they're falling behind so quickly that they can't rely on the running game and Derrick Henry. There's a little bit more concern after what we saw just last week. Now, after him, we got Alvin Kamara, 7.5 fantasy points last week, and the return of Taysom Hill just adds another mouth to this backfield that's going to get touches. And it's really hard to nail down what type of role does Alvin Kamara play each week. One week he's leading the team in touches on the ground, the next week he's leading all running backs in targets. It's different every single week, and it's making it very confusing. Same with his teammate Chris Olave, only 9.4 fantasy points, but he still had 11 targets. They just couldn't do anything deeper down the field because that New York Giants pass rush was getting in the face of Spencer Rattler too quickly. Same can be said about another New Orleans Saint. How about Juwan Johnson? 2.7 fantasy points last week, but his snaps are starting to decrease. And that right there is a little bit alarming. This is now 3 straight weeks we've seen his snaps decrease, so this is definitely something to watch. He may not be some weekly must-start tight end anymore. Then we had Travion Henderson in New England. 3.7 fantasy points, and I don't understand why they hate this guy. Fumbles, injuries, it doesn't matter. They're going to rely heavily on Ramondre Stevenson every single week in New England. At this point, I'm pretty convinced that Ramondre Stevenson has pictures of Mike Vrabel cheating on his wife or something, because it doesn't matter. If he fumbles, he goes out there and gets all the touchdown opportunities. Travion Henderson just out there fighting for scraps. Now, Antonio Gibson did go down with injury, so hopefully going forward, they scheme more touches going the way of Travion Henderson. Then we had Zay Flowers at 9.7 fantasy points, and this could honestly be a mainstay on this show with Cooper Rush. It's going to be that bad throwing the ball down the field. Then A.J. Brown is out there telling the press that, Jalen Hurts just missed him deep. But if you really watch the replay, he kind of slowed down a little bit. So maybe had he not slowed down, he would have been able to bring in that deep ball. Drama still in Philadelphia. A.J. Brown has sucked waivos for multiple weeks now. Chase Brown, honestly, 8.3 fantasy points, that's better than I even expected with a Jake Browning-led offense and a defense that gives up so many points. Typically, they're playing from behind. Chase Brown isn't racking up volume on the ground. The fact that he got 8.3 fantasy points last week is honestly, at this point, kind of a win. But as far as him returning draft value with a high ceiling, that's where my level of panic is super high, because I don't see that happening very consistently. Now that gets us through the list of players who sucked for the most part last week. How about some upcoming bye weeks this week? Only 2 teams, thankfully, because there are so many injuries, we can't handle bye weeks right now. The Minnesota Vikings are going to be on bye, so no Jordan Mason, no Justin Jefferson, no Jordan Addison, no TJ Hawkinson. But we also do not have the Houston Texans, no CJ Stroud, no Nico Collins. I didn't list Woody Marks because right now, I don't know how reliant we want to be on Woody Marks. But luckily, like I said, only 2 teams on a bye, so that is definitely going to help us this week. But all right, now let's go ahead and dive into the waiver wire and see what may be available for you this week. Now, we'll start off at the quarterback position. We got 3 guys here. First up, Matthew Stafford of the Los Angeles Rams. Now, he is over 50% owned. He may not be out there in a lot of leagues, but go out there and check just in case if you need help at the quarterback position. Because right now, he is the quarterback 5 overall in fantasy football, has 18 plus fantasy points now in 3 of the 5 games this year, and he is currently the lowest owned top 12 fantasy quarterback in fantasy football. Now, on top of all of that, he gets a matchup this upcoming week against Baltimore, who just gave up over 40 points to the Houston Texans. That defense is so hurt. If you can start Matthew Stafford, it's probably a good week to do so. Then we have Sam Darnold in Seattle. He's 25% owned with a matchup going up against Jacksonville. He's the QB 14 overall on the year, averaging just a hair under 17 fantasy points per game. In fact, he hasn't scored under 16 fantasy points in a game since week 1, and he now has 9 passing touchdowns in just the last 4 games of the season. The offense is overall healthy. Now, this may not be the easiest matchup, but with how Sam Darnold has played over the last month of the season, he is definitely a solid fantasy fill-in if needed. And then lastly, Tua Tagovailoa, 25% owned with a matchup going up against the Chargers. Somehow he loses Tyreek Hill and has his best game of the year. 256 yards passing, 3 touchdowns, and he completed 75% of his passes against a Carolina defense that had been pretty solid against opposing wide receivers. Now, this upcoming week, they got a matchup going up against the Chargers. They're going to have to throw the ball once again. If you need a bye week fill-in at the quarterback position, Tua should be an option for a lot of people out there. Which will then take us down to the running back position. First up, I'm going to mention Rico Dowdle. He's 50% owned in leagues as of right now. Chuba Hubbard getting ruled out late last week. A lot of people was winning and swiped up Rico Dowdle, and if you did, hopefully you started him because dude absolutely exploded. Now, typically, I don't like buying in to lower tier guys after a huge blow up game because you end up overpaying on the waiver wire, especially since Rico Dowdle went out and had 200 yards. I mean, come on, a lot of that had to do with the matchup going up against Miami. But they've listed Chuba as week to week, which means there's no guarantee he's coming back. And now the Carolina Panthers and Rico Dowdle get a matchup against Dallas. Not only one of the worst defenses in the NFL, but this is a revenge game for Rico Dowdle. So if you are desperate for running back help and he's out there, maybe we do pay up just a little bit. Then we go down to Kendre Miller in New Orleans. He's 30% owned as of right now. Now he's creeped up to 10 plus touches now in back-to-back games. Really looks like the best running back on the ground in New Orleans. But now Taysom Hill has returned and he's back to his old ways, taking a few carries out of the backfield. He had 6 rush attempts for -1 yards last week. That kind of hurts the overall potential of Kendre Miller, but he is one of the only available running backs right now, wildly available on the waiver wire, that's getting 10 plus touches a week. Now after him, we got Michael Carter in Arizona. He's 40% owned after last week not really knowing what to do with Amari DiMercado or Michael Carter. Talk about a nightmare backfield though. If it wasn't for a drop touchdown on the goal line by Amari DiMercado, the Cardinals would have had multiple backs score at least 12 fantasy points. Now Jonathan Gannon was absolutely hot at Amari DiMercado after he dropped the ball right there on the goal line. But it's not like Michael Carter went out there and dominated. He averaged 2.8 yards per carry, and now they get a tougher matchup this week going up against Indianapolis. He should see the volume. Is it going to be efficient volume, though? That could be the biggest question. Then we go down to Isaiah Davis of the New York Jets, only 5% owned going up against Denver. And really the only reason we're bringing him up is we saw Braylon Allen go down in week 4, and then Breece Hall got banged up in week 5 a little bit but he missed a few series, but he was able to come back and finish the game. However, if there are any limitations to him this week, Isaiah Davis is the next man up. Which then brings us to the Los Angeles Chargers. We mentioned earlier about the injury to Omarion Hampton. Well, if he can't go, who runs the ball for the Chargers? We got Hassan Haskins, we got Kamani Vidal, and we have no idea who's going to get the majority of the volume. This is really similar to what we saw last week with the Arizona Cardinals. It really leaves us a guessing game this week. Who gets the most touches between these guys? Both of them had 5 touches for less than 20 total yards in week 5. Basically, a 50-50 split. Now, we know that Harbaugh loves himself some Hassan Haskins. How do we know that? Well, he coached him at Michigan. But then, he also drafted Kamani Vidal last year. This could easily be a pure 50-50 split unless one of these guys gets hot. The problem with that is, we won't know who's hot until the game has already started, but this is a great matchup here against Miami. They were torched on the ground last week. They continue to be torched almost every week on the ground. We're watching practice reports and we're trying to nail down who is the guy in the backfield of the Los Angeles Chargers, because if we can figure that out, they may be start-worthy here in week 6. But now let's move down to the wide receiver position. First up is Romeo Doubs of the Green Bay Packers. He's 50% owned as well, but he's coming off a bye week, so he may be sitting on your waiver wire. He's got a matchup going up against Cincinnati. Like I said, coming off the bye is a great opportunity to pick up a player that may have slipped through the cracks a little bit. He is the safest Green Bay wide receiver at the moment, and honestly, this has to do with matchup as well, going up against the Cincinnati Bengals. Now, Romeo Doubs isn't some weekly must-start guy. He's more of a bye-week fill-in, especially with all the injuries that we have in the NFL right now. But Doubs going against the Bengals, not bad here this week. We also have Josh Downs. He's 48% owned going up against Arizona. He's finally starting to get more looks in this offense. Now, unfortunately, everything that he is seeing is pretty short and not deeper down the field, but this Colts offense has scored at least 29 points in 4 of their 5 games this year, and we always try to target weapons in high-powered offenses. Kind of weird to say high-powered and Indianapolis Colts in the same sentence, but they have been for the most part here early in 2025. Then Jalen Coker of the Carolina Panthers, we mentioned him last week. He's only 15% owned, a matchup going up against Dallas, and he could return this week. His practice window was opened up, but we saw Jimmy Horn in week 5, and honestly, when he touched the ball, he looked pretty good. But we've also seen Hunter Renfrow play well in the past, but don't forget, the Carolina Panthers love themselves some Jalen Coker, and once he's 100% healthy and he returns, he should definitely get volume in this passing game. How about Kendrick Bourne of the San Francisco 49ers? Only 10% owned, but dude absolutely exploded in week 5 with no Brock Purdy, no Ricky Pearsall, no Juwan Jennings, no George Kittle. He had 11 targets, 10 catches, and 142 yards. Now, there's no guarantee that these guys are all going to be out again this week. However, there's a good chance that a lot of these guys are not available. George Kittle more than likely will not be back off of IR. Pearsall and Jennings haven't really been 100% for multiple weeks, and Mac Jones looked just fine last week if he has to start again. Then on top of all of that, they get a matchup going up against Tampa Bay, whose secondary is banged up right now. Kendrick Bourne is definitely another option in week 6. How about Isaiah Bond of the Cleveland Browns? And honestly, I don't love this one. He's only 8% owned, and it's really hard to take much away from a game in London last week, but that was Dylan Gabriel's first start, and he gave Isaiah Bond 8 targets in their first game together. Now, it only turned him to 2 catches for 29 yards, but this is definitely one of those duos that could build chemistry as the season continues. If you're picking up Isaiah Bond, though, he's definitely just a bench stash at this time. I don't feel safe enough to throw him into my lineup. Then we got Ryan Flournoy of the Dallas Cowboys, and had himself a great week in week 5, and as of right now, he shows 0% owned across the board. And there was so much talk last week about Jalen Tolbert, and with the chance that he could get with CeeDee Lamb out and Kevontae Turpin out, but no, it wasn't Tolbert. He only had 1 target. It was Ryan Flournoy, who had 9 targets, 6 receptions, and 114 yards. He played in 57% of the snaps. Now, if Dallas is still struggling with injuries in week 6, Flournoy could be another option for us this week. But now, let's talk about some tight ends, because for the first time, Actually, probably the second time, because we talked about most of these guys last week. There's options out there on the waiver wire. The first one up, I'm going to mention Darren Waller anyway, even though he's 52% owned. His snaps increased from 28% to 58%, and that's going to continue to grow. If nothing else, he's going to remain a major red zone threat in Miami, who's going to be throwing the football a lot because their defense gives up a lot of points. Darren Waller should not be sitting on any waiver wires by next week. Then we get Mason Taylor. Talked about him for a long time. Only 10% owned. He plays for the Jets. And honestly, he's had 6+ targets now in 3 straight games, but he just had a career high in targets, receptions, and yards last week with 12 targets, 9 receptions, and 67 yards. He is the clear number 2 option in the passing game of the New York Jets behind Garrett Wilson. Then we go down to Jake Tonjes of the San Francisco 49ers. He's still only 10% owned going up against Tampa Bay, and he is thriving off of touchdowns as of right now because he hasn't had over 60 yards in a game yet, but has touchdowns in 3 of the 5 games this season. With George Kittle more than likely still out, Pearsall and Jennings not 100%, we could definitely see Jake Tonjes put together another solid game this week against Tampa Bay, who struggles against opposing tight ends. And then lastly, Theo Johnson in New York. He's only 9% owned. And we have talked so much about his relationship with Jackson Dart. These two are basically best friends, and we're seeing the immediate chemistry. It's why we've been telling people to pick up Theo Johnson. You can go ahead and start Theo Johnson. He now has 3 touchdowns over the last 2 games, and his targets have increased in 3 straight. Now, yes, you may say he is somewhat touchdown dependent, but have you looked at the tight end landscape? The majority of tight ends are touchdown dependent. At least give me the guy who's getting those touchdown opportunities, a young playmaker, a big-bodied tight end that can make big plays. Which brings us to the end of the players on the waiver wire. It's a pretty thin waiver wire as of right now, just so many injuries and bye weeks are not helping. But let's go ahead and put these in a power rankings list for you. Now, like I usually do, I know not everyone needs a quarterback or a tight end, so I put them at the bottom of the list. However, I rank them in order for their position. But now, if you're looking for the best options on the waiver wire, this is how I'm ranking these players. Rico Dowdle at the top, followed by Michael Carter. Now, why do I not have Kendrick Bourne above Michael Carter? Running backs are a lot harder to find than wide receivers, so more times than not, I'm going to put the running back a little bit higher. Then we get Kendrick Bourne, Romeo Doubs, probably 2 of the safest options that we can start immediately if needed, followed by Josh Downs and Ryan Flournoy of the Dallas Cowboys. Then we get down to Jalen Coker. If we knew for sure he was 100% in starting, he would probably be just below Romeo Doubs for me, but we do not know that yet. Then we followed up with Kendry Miller, Isaiah Bond, and Isaiah Davis, going back-to-back Isaiah here to round out the top 10. Then we go down to Hassan Haskins and Kamani Vidal. Now, if something comes out this week, early in the week, and they say, hey, so-and-so is going to be the guy to get the first touches, he's going to lead this backfield in touches, they would move up this list dramatically. We just have no idea who it's actually going to be. If I had to guess, it's Hassan Haskins, but that is pure speculation at this point. Now, after that, if you need a quarterback, I have him ranked in the order of Matthew Stafford, Sam Darnold, and then Tua Tagovailoa. And then the tight end position, we got Darren Waller, Theo Johnson, Jake Tonjes, and then lastly, Mason Taylor. Now, why is Mason Taylor at the bottom? He still plays for the Jets, and it's almost impossible to trust them with anything. But now that we know how we're ranking them, should we be starting or just stashing these guys? Now, for Rico Dowdle, Michael Carter, Kendrick Bourne, Romeo Doubs, and Josh Downs, if I had to, I would start them in week 6. After that, though, Ryan Flournoy, Jalen Coker, Kendry Miller, Isaiah Bond, Isaiah Davis, Hassan Haskins, Kamani Vidal, more picking them up as a stash in week 6 just to see what happens. And then lastly, obviously, if we have some streaming quarterback or tight end options, all of those guys are going to be start worthy in week 6. But how much do we want to spend on these guys? And honestly, this isn't one of those weeks where I want to blow a huge portion of my FAAB budget. I have Rico Dowdle up to 35%, and that's for those RB needy teams. A revenge game against Dallas, coming off of a 200-yard game. Okay, I'll bite on that. Michael Carter, probably up to 30% or so. After Amari DiMercado's fumble there on the goal line with how pissed Jonathan Gannon was, Michael Carter probably going to get the lion's share of snaps in Arizona for the next few weeks. Then we have Kendrick Bourne up to 20%, along with Romeo Doubs and Josh Downs right there in that same area. Then we go down to Ryan Flournoy, Jalen Coker, Kendry Miller, Isaiah Bond, Isaiah Davis, Hassan Haskins, and Kamani Vidal all go up to 15%. I don't want to put too much FAAB budget into them because their role and their ability to start on my fantasy team is still kind of up in the air. Then when we get down to the quarterbacks and tight ends, typically, I try to keep the quarterbacks right around 10%. More than likely, you have multiple options on your waiver wire that you can start this week if needed. If that's the case, no reason in really overpaying for one of them when you can get another one of them for a lot cheaper. At the tight end position, Darren Waller, I'll go up to 30%. This guy needs to be owned. Theo Johnson, Jake Tonjes, and Mason Taylor, more so 25% or so, because honestly, I could see at least two of these three guys, maybe not Tonjes once we get George Kittle back, but Theo Johnson and Mason Taylor could be startable for your fantasy football team for the remainder of the season. Which now takes us over to the Streamin Ds, and we got three of them. We got the Colts, we got the Steelers, and we got the Packers. Now for the Colts, they're going up against the Arizona Cardinals, who are one of the lowest scoring teams in the NFL. This Colts defense has been playing great as of late, and they've held opponents twice this year to single-digit points. How about the Pittsburgh Steelers? They're coming off the bye week, and they're going up against a Cleveland offense who has scored the second fewest points on the year. Now, this Pittsburgh defense hasn't been the healthiest, but coming off the bye and getting a home game should be a big-time boost. And then the Packers defense as well. They're coming off the bye week. They could have been dropped pre-bye because of how they looked before the bye week, but now they get a matchup going up against the Cincinnati Bengals, who are also one of the lowest scoring teams in the NFL. Plus, we know at this point that Jake Browning is good for a few turnovers a week. So now let's move in to some players that you should be able to drop right now in fantasy football. I know y'all love this section. First up is Braylon Allen, running back of the New York Jets. He's still 30% owned. He's going to miss the majority of the rest of the fantasy season due to injury. He's no longer needing to be rostered. How about Jacoby Myers? 90% owned out there in fantasy football, and I get it. I know why. The potential should be there, but now he has back-to-back games with not even 35 yards receiving. He hasn't gone over 70 yards in a game since week 1, and he has 3 straight games with less than 8 fantasy points, and they didn't even have Brock Bowers last week. But aside from that, Bowers hasn't been healthy in multiple weeks, and we still aren't seeing an uptick in production to Jacoby Myers. Now, I'm not going to go out there and drop Jacoby Myers for some nonsense, but if there is a player out there on waivers that's producing a little bit more consistently, I would definitely think about it at this point. Now, after him, we got a couple Browns. We got Cedric Tillman. We got Jerry Jeudy. Now, Tillman's 25% owned. He's considered week to week at this point. He may miss a few more games. And it's not like with this Cleveland passing game, he's going to come back and be somebody that consistently produces anyway. Same for Jerry Jeudy, who is 85% owned right now. This dude should be eating targets on a weekly basis, but he just had 2 catches for 15 yards and wasn't even close to leading the team in targets. Dylan Gabriel did not look his way. And honestly, the fact that he looked the way of Isaiah Bond more is enough for me to maybe part ways with Jerry Jeudy at this point of the fantasy season. Now, after him is Rashad Bateman of the Baltimore Ravens. He's 30% owned as of right now, and with or without Lamar Jackson, Rashad Bateman hasn't been reliable enough to start. Now, after what we saw from Cooper Rush in week 5, Rashad Bateman is for sure drop worthy. But all right, that's everything that you need to know to start off week 6 of fantasy football. I know between the bye weeks and the injuries, it has been absolutely disgusting out there. We are having to use players by week 5 that we probably never expected to use the entire season. But don't get discouraged. Don't give up. I've seen teams before start like 1-4 and 0-5, make the fantasy playoffs and make a run. Because in this game, it's not how you start, it's how you finish.